Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. My name is James Batchelor. Thank you very much for joining us. Today on the show, we've got Rupert Pontin, Director of Insights at Cazana. So lovely to have you on, Rupert. Hello.
Hi, James. Nice to see you again.
Lovely to have you on. We are constantly talking about used cars at the moment because it is very much flavour of the month, really, for car dealers at the moment because it's a wildly changing picture, and it's nice to be able to get the latest data from companies such as yourselves. Can we just start with June? What did you see during June, and what have you seen, particularly so in the last week of June as well?
Okay, so June was an interesting month, obviously, because it was the time that the dealers were able to open their doors again and welcome people into the showrooms. The dynamic in terms of pricing actually didn't shift hugely from where it had been probably during most of May. What I mean by that, James, is that the pricing moved on a week-by-week basis, as it has been through the lockdown period. June was interesting because we saw a different dynamic in relation to vehicle supply as well. But during the course of the whole month, we saw a variety of movements week by week that actually, when you looked at the month as a whole, meant that prices were reasonably static. So during the course of the weeks, we saw different movements. But actually, when you look at the month as a whole, there was a slight increase, but not a huge amount.
And what were the biggest? I sort of know the answer to this one, but what were the biggest winners and the biggest losers? I am presuming it's smaller cars or cars at the cheaper end of the market, and big cars like SUVs probably have fallen a bit.
Well, interestingly, there has been quite a lot of activity in the sort of 7 to 10-year marketplace and the 10-year marketplace and older. We kind of know what that's about, and that's really, I think, because people are not wanting to travel on public transport, and I think they're considering looking at a secondary vehicle or a third vehicle even, just to get them to and from work. So actually the activity we've seen in that area of the marketplace has been reasonably active. We have seen, from a pricing perspective, over the whole month, for £0 to £10,000 cars, the price actually increased by 0.72%, which isn't huge. If you compare that, though, against 2019, where that upward lift was only 0.8%, you can see there's quite a change there. In terms of stock, in the early part of the month for that particular price range, the number of new adverts appearing on the marketplace shot up in that first week, as it did with most things. But actually, when you look at that week on week, that started to decline as the month went through. And I think that's really because of the constraints within the supply chain. So, the dealers aren't able to get hold of new vehicles to replace those. So that goes some way to explaining why the price increased. The other thing you mentioned there was talking about larger SUVs and perhaps MPVs. Well, the activity we've seen in the MPV sector has been very interesting. So I think there are two reasons for that. We have seen price increases during the course of the month. And in fact, I think it was not last week, the previous week, we actually saw an increase of just over 5% for MPV sector. Now, I think that has probably been driven again by the fact that people are not wanting to travel on public transport, but particularly in the MPV market, there are 2 points to consider. Firstly, there are families, and I think the families are looking at not travelling by plane this year for their holiday because that's largely restricted, and looking at maybe more day trips, a family holiday within the UK, and therefore looking for something a little bit nicer in which they can travel. So I think that has pushed prices up slightly, and the reason that's happened is because there's so little stock. The other side of this is that there is the thought process that for some industries, for certain sectors of the economy where moving people in number is important, actually using an MPV is going to provide themselves with a greater flexibility to get more people in the car. So rather than having two people sitting up front together, and that's a little bit dangerous, or supposedly dangerous, you have a larger space for people to sit in. So we've seen some activity there. But so it was that sub £10,000 bracket that's seen a boost in pricing. But interestingly, as you look higher up the price ranges, we've also seen price increases there. one of the significant growths in price over the course of the month was for cars between 70 and 90,000 pounds. So we've seen a jump in pricing there. The thought process perhaps behind that is that you do have an element of entrepreneur, you have an element of own business users that actually have decided they're going to spend a little bit of money. There aren't too many cars in that price range, and it's lifted price up.
The irony with all of this, though, particularly with MPVs, is that in the new car market, we all know that MPVs are not fashionable cars. You know, manufacturers are getting rid of them left, right, and centre because they're unfashionable. People have gone into SUVs, and yet in the used market, people are starting to pay a bit more interest in them. And that's, like you were saying, that is purely because they are practical cars. And it's interesting, during times where there is a big crisis, practical cars take on a newfound interest, don't they? Appeal,
yes.
Newfound appeal.
Yes, I think you're right. I think they do. And you're right. The difficulty that the industry will have in the coming weeks with that type of vehicle is symptomatic of what you said. A number of the manufacturers have stopped making those vehicles. They've pushed people towards the SUV vehicles and sort of the development of niche marketplaces we've seen over recent years, you know, the small SUV and so forth. And those particular types of vehicles are still popular. But we need to be aware, not just at this particular moment, but in the coming, year, 2 years, but there are so many more of those cars coming back to the marketplace that potentially we will see downward price pressure on those. But that's certainly not for the moment. That's a little bit further in the future. Yeah, very interesting that the OEMs moved away from that kind of vehicle, and now we're seeing that demand driven by COVID, really.
Is there also an element in the marketplace at the moment? Well, particularly during lockdown, where people they've got used to having a large SUV, a large gas guzzler, so to speak, parked outside their drive. For years, they've always liked those kinds of cars. And yet, when people were forced to remain at home for 4 or 5 weeks, they were looking out of the kitchen window at this massive car and thinking, actually, do I really need that kind of car? Perhaps we could make do with something a little bit smaller, something a little bit more environmentally friendly, for instance.
Now, that's a really interesting question, James, and that's quite difficult to answer. I have an anecdotal answer to that. I myself have 2 very large cars sitting on the driveway that have not really been doing very much. Yeah. I think that the environmental aspect is very important here. I think that during the lockdown period, where we have seen the volume of pollution in our environment, in our atmosphere, come down significantly, if you look around the coastline where there's been less traffic on the sea, you see clearer water. People certainly in central London and major conurbations are able to breathe better. I think there has been an increase in interest in battery electric vehicles and hybrids. Interesting looking at new car statistics, where you see that in the last couple of months or so, the top sellers, albeit in a very small marketplace, were Tesla with Model 3, Jaguar I-Pace in March and April, sitting right up at the top. But I think that has caused the public to think about the type of vehicle they use. They like the fact there's less pollution around. So I think there's an element of that. I'm not so sure, and just to quantify, we can see that impact within the data in terms of new vehicles being added on a week-by-week basis, in terms of retail adverts, in terms of what's been happening with pricing performance up and down, but generally an upward movement for BEVs and FEVs over the course of certainly June and lockdown period. But in terms of sort of people looking outside and saying, do they want to get rid of their big car? I'm not so sure that we can see that in the data. It's not to say it's not happening, though.
Yeah. Let's just talk about electric cars briefly. Electric cars, particularly in the UK, they've been around as the mass market electric cars, been around for 10 years or so, really. And do you think we're now getting to the stage where people are becoming a lot more familiar with electric cars? We've had at least 5 years of electric cars offering good amount of range for most people. As those cars now come out of PCPs and into the used market, do you think those prices are likely to be going up in the future because they just become more appealing to more people?
Okay, I think there's a couple of good points in there. So firstly, I think you're right. We have seen an increase in the number of those vehicles in the marketplace, and we have begun to get used to the thought process around an electric vehicle. I think that there is still a psychological blocker to people around range, even with vehicles over the last few years. Yes, you're right. It may be that somebody can quite happily survive with a vehicle that will do 60 to 100 miles of electric vehicle range 99% of the time. But in the public's mind, there is that 1% that they say, oh, what happens if I need to travel to the South Coast today? I can't do it, which is a very rare occurrence. But I think that that has continued to be a blocker. But what I will say is that in the past 4 to 6 months, where we have seen an increase in the volume of vehicles with what one would term a fuel tank range, a petrol tank range, that's the point that's making the difference to people psychologically, because they then feel, yeah, well, it would be just the same as having to stop to fill up my car. Okay, so I have to stop for 40 minutes, but by the time I've been and had a bite to eat, visited the facilities, I'm back on the road. So I think that we, in the past 4 to 6 months, have absolutely seen a sea change in popularity and desirability of those vehicles. Now, when those cars come back to the market, we have a couple of things to consider. First of all, currently, a battery electric vehicle has a very high retained residual value. And by that, I mean, at the moment, if you look at a 1-year-old vehicle, it sits 5 to 10%, that's off my head without looking at the figures exactly, but quite a lot higher than its petrol counterpart. So that situation, I don't believe, is sustainable as we go forward in the next 18 months to 2 years, as we start to see more volume coming back to the marketplace, okay? So I think that in general terms, we will see an erosion of intrinsic value against the percentage of original cost new. Where we're going to see some really interesting activity is in the value of older technology. So we saw this with the Renault Zoe, as the Renault Zoe has gone through its iterations. And where technology is moving so fast and the range from one vehicle with an enhanced battery to another is changing so much, it tends to mean that the value of the previous battery technology or that particular model tends to fall away quite quickly. The desirability isn't there. So we're going to go through a period, I think, of quite rapid change where we see when a new capability comes through in terms of range, that will inhibit the value of the outgoing model quite significantly, I think.
That's really interesting. Let's just talk a bit about the supply chain. It's an issue that we've been talking about for the past month or so. And as you know, it's causing dealers huge headaches because, of course, they've purchased stock to fill out gaps on their forecourt, and yet the supply chain isn't smooth or quick enough for them to get the product. Are you starting to see that change now, or is it still a big problem?
I think it's still a pretty big problem. As well as working for Cazana, I'm also a director of the Vehicle Remarketing Association, and therefore I have some very, very close connections with what's happening here. I'm not going to talk about individual companies, but generally speaking, they are still struggling greatly to be able to collect vehicles, get them on site, get them cleaned, and most importantly, you're right, get them delivered to the dealer. It's not difficult to drive down the road at the moment and just look at dealer forecourts and you see that they've got a very low level of stock on them. And when cars do come on, they sell very, very quickly. And there's an enormous amount of frustration, not just from the dealer who wants to get hold of what he's bought, but also on behalf of the auction companies, the wholesalers, those remarketing companies, that, they've sold the car, they want it off site. They want the dealer to have it so they can rotate. But the difficulty is around the social distancing and the cleanliness that's required, and the difficulties within having multi movements of a vehicle on site. How many times do you clean that car? How do you make sure those people are staying apart from each other? Back to that MPV discussion. Rather than using a van on site, they're buying an MPV or retaining an MPV to move it around. So I think that is still prevalent at the moment, and I think from the discussions that we have as part of the VRA meetings overall, that's likely to continue for some weeks still. There are still some staff that work within that part of the industry that are still on furlough, which means they're battling with a lower volume of staff. And quite understandably, some of those staff are uncomfortable to come back to work knowing that they're going to be in such a close environment. So this isn't something that's going to be solved overnight. It is something that at the moment the retailers and the supply chain will have to get used to. And I understand the retailers' frustration, but we also need to bear in mind that, you know, the guys that they're phoning and trying to get their cars from are also desperate to get them off site, and they're frustrated too.
Yeah. And I suppose with the threat of spikes in infection numbers of coronavirus, and the possibility of having lockdowns in different parts of the country for the rest of the year, this could be a problem that we have for a very long time. Do you think?
Yeah, I think there is that potential. There are so many solutions that one can put in place that remain cost effective, and that stands for both the dealers but also for the supply chain. It's not as simple as just going out and employing more people and saying, okay, well, you move a car on your own. If you do that, then costs have to go up. Somebody has to pay for that. Is it the retailer? Well, the retailer is going to be able to do it, but at the moment we know that the vehicle margin is being squeezed because of the prices they're having to pay for vehicles. So there is no simple answer to this, and you're right, I think it will be around for a while. I think during these summer months we're doing better in relation to the spread of the virus. Once we get into the colder months again, who knows what will happen. Really the only probable saving factor here is if somebody develops a vaccine and we're all able to get vaccinated. But even that in itself will take 6 months plus to vaccinate the whole population.
Yeah, it's going to be an issue that's going to be, well, I think we're going to be talking about for quite some time.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Finally, we know how we've spoken about June. Looking ahead for I know we've only just started July, but what's your early indications for July and for the next few months ahead?
Okay, so for July, we believe that the retail consumer demand will remain pretty good. We also believe that and understand the reality of the supply of vehicles, which means that it is going to continue to be difficult for the retailers to replace stock, which is why it's so important that nobody goes and reduces price just for the hell of it. They don't need to at the moment. If anything, they need to be pushing prices up where they can do, because they need to extend their margin. And that's going to be a difficult discussion point and a complicated strategy to try and implement over the coming weeks. So certainly, I think during July and part of August, we're going to see a continuation of supply difficulty and therefore price strength. Once we start heading towards the autumn time, I think we have a different set of factors that we need to consider. And those factors are difficult to predict, but we are aware that there are a number of people that will sadly lose employment, and that will have an impact on desirability and their ability to buy, and that's a very, very difficult circumstance to come to terms with. So we expect to see unemployment go up. We expect to see the country slip into a recession, which hopefully will only be for a short period of time, and we will come out of that relatively swiftly. Of course, we at this point don't know the impact of the differences in operational aspects of just about every sector of the economy, because things are going to be done in a different way, and we could be in a position where, whilst some jobs are lost, a lot are created elsewhere. And the other thing we have to consider is that some of those people that have been on furlough and have been able to save some money and have some extra disposable income actually will start to go back to popping out for a meal and so forth. And actually disposable income for them all of a sudden starts to return to pre-COVID times, and they realize they don't have quite as much money to spend. So those are some of the things we need to consider, but I don't think they're going to start to come into place until into the autumn time. It also depends on what further measures that Rishi Sunak and the government put into place to A, support industry, but B, support those people that have lost their jobs, and in terms of job creation as well. But I think it's fairly clear that this government has said that they are not going to return to the austerity that the Conservative government has had in recent years, and I think that's a positive thing, and I think there's been a good level of support demonstrated.
I know I said that was my last question, but I've just got one more.
Don't worry.
Just a very small one. Obviously, there are lots of parallels between what we're going through now as opposed to the 2008, 2009 recession. Do you think, or is it too early to say, but this is going to be worse than that? Or because we've experienced things like that in the past, we are better prepared this time around?
Well, James, I think we're probably better prepared, but the circumstances are very different in what's happened. And whilst there are some limiting factors that have resulted from the lockdown period, I think it's probably quite likely that we'll see a quicker bounce back than we saw after 2008 and 2009. This was forced upon us by circumstances beyond our control. In many respects, 2008, 2009, that was forced upon us, but we knew why it had happened. And the psychological effects of that from a business perspective took a long time to overcome. And my feeling here is that we will overcome that quicker. From our perspective, when we are looking at doing the future forecasting for our lending customers and so forth, we are not seeing at this point a significant damage to residual values in a year's time, 2 years' time, and so forth. And I think that view, is because we're basing that on a large quantity of retail data. We're using data science, and I think we have a very different perspective on what will happen, which we justify through our data, than some of our competitors do. So there are similarities, but I think the outcome from this will be swifter and it will be more positive.
Rupert, thank you very much indeed. That was some fascinating insight there. Thank you very much for joining us. Really
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, James.
Okay, so if you'd like to be involved in one of these, then please do email me, james.batchelor@blackballmedia.co.uk. But until next time, thank you very much indeed, and bye-bye.